These paintings capture the light and beauty in everyday moments, whether depicting industrial processes or highlighting the landscapes of the Midwest. Each one heightens our appreciation of our surroundings, from the patterns of clouds in the sky to the reflections of bare trees in a creek. They give us new ways to better see the world around us. On this edition of Art Now, we'll look at the work of Donald K. Lake.
Hi, welcome to Art Now, a program where we talk to artists whose work is part of our community. I'm Pat Salmon, and I'll be your host. Our guest today is Donald K. Lake, Professor Emeritus at Parkland College. He was a professor of art at Parkland from 1970 to 2004, and the program director for art and design from 1979 to 2004. He earned his BFA and MFA from Wichita State University. So thanks for being here today, Don.
Thank you
Appreciate
for inviting me.
I'd like to start with, what got you interested in being an artist?
I had a family that valued the arts and creative activities, and art was just one of the several hobbies I had as a kid. So I wasn't one of those kids who just drew all the time particularly, but in time I had some influential teachers. In high school, a couple of influential art teachers, and then as I began college, I'd begun to form some kind of an idea of myself as an artist, and perhaps as a college professor. Those were the two things I had kind of envisioned as my possible future. And I had a couple of professors who were very influential and encouraged me in that direction. So it really was, there was not a moment where I realized that I had a gift, but I just sort of proceeded along this path.
Yeah. I know most of your work has been watercolor. Is there a reason that you prefer that medium to, say, oils or some other medium?
It's an accident that I'm a watercolor painter.
Oh,
actually,
okay.
that I spent my first 10 years or so as a painter working on large oil paintings, mostly in an abstract kind of idiom. And when I finished school and began to teach, my teaching duties, my all day, every day, almost 24/7 concerns then were teaching people to draw realistically. One of the skills I had been expected to learn and did learn in school, but didn't really factor into my work very much. But in time, I began to look for other branches of instruction that would feed into that drawing. And watercolor was just one of those things I picked up without any serious interest. I didn't take it seriously because my teachers in college and my colleagues didn't take it seriously.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise
me. It was
me.
considered a kind of a Sunday painter medium, and something that seemed to be surrounded by a lot of gimmickry and technique and not a whole lot of depth. So that's how I approached it, thinking this is a weekend project. But I found it kind of interesting, and I enjoyed just the task of learning to do it and learning the technique. And little by little, it was just a very seductive thing. It just sort of took me over. And then, and even now, looking back, I can't imagine I could have spent 30 years doing this. But now I can imagine spending another 30 easily. It's just a medium that keeps growing for me.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, it is amazing what you do with those. And given that, let's take a look at a few images from each of the three types of paintings you've done over the years.
Okay.
We have industrial settings, landscapes that you've done in the studio, and on-location landscapes. So let's start with the industrial images. Just take it at the first three here.
Okay. The industry is a body of work that I began in the late 80s, and after doing about 10 years with figures and shiny reflective things, one of my interests was in fire trucks, shiny old World War II airplanes, and mostly surfaces. So I had already kind of connected with the man-made things. And I was sort of looking for other ways to think about the man-made environment. So that's one aspect of the industry. Secondly, I had always as a kid been around a lot of construction. I loved to play around houses being built, apartments being built. They were in our neighborhood and we went there and played.
Yeah.
And my dad, second thought is my dad worked at a large oil refinery. So there was always that sort of connection to these places and a bit of a mystery. What's on the other side of the fence? And the funny sights and smells and sounds. And so at one point I got a chance to get inside the fence. And I took a lot of photographs and began to think about what can I do with this? And one thing, it just began to unfold for me there.
Yeah.
And so that's how I got to the industry. Later on, I began to work with imagery like this with fiery stuff. As I got into some foundries and steel mills particularly, it became my quest for fire from then on. And those are the kinds of industries I was interested in. I was tired of racks of pipes and tanks, and I was ready for fire. So this piece is from a steel mill in Detroit called McLouth Steel, and it's an old-fashioned. This is a blast furnace. Most industry now, most steel is made in something they call mini mills. They just melt down scrap and with these enormous electrodes and realloy it and use it again. But this is when they still use the coke and the
Right.
Iron ore, and it's the old-fashioned process. Very exciting to see.
Yeah, it catches the drama of it. That whole painting does.
This next painting is at the Ford River Rouge plant in Dearborn, Detroit. This particular plant dates to 1917. On this day, they were making Mustang cars. I happened to get in there because I'd been commissioned to do some large paintings for the Federal Reserve Bank in Chicago. As part of their development of a new collection of art, a number of artists were invited to do commissioned work. And what they wanted me to do was to visit in the 5-state area that they administer some of the large industries that they work with. And so they opened doors for me. It's very difficult sometimes to get inside these places, but they opened some great doors for me. One of them was at River Rouge. One of my great heroes is Charles Sheeler. Sheeler, particularly for his drawings, he was also a great photographer. But he was under retainer to the Ford Motor Company for many years of his career. And so I had seen these wonderful images, paintings and photos and drawings of places that I finally got to see in person for myself.
That's great.
And it was very exciting place to be. These cars in this picture actually are silver. They're unpainted steel.
Okay.
But because of the light, it took on this eerie green glow.
Yes.
As you look at my work, one of the things you notice is that it's mostly about a quality of light, or in the later years, more about a color of light. And so that sort of characterizes what I'm trying to do and gives me a chance to maneuver beyond the sort of the sense of detail or truth.
Right.
This is another piece I did during that period. One of the places I went for the Federal Reserve Bank was to a large shipbuilding outfit up in Door County, and then on up at the top of the lake at Marinette, Michigan. And this place they just brought into this dry dock large Coast Guard vessel, and we're just draining it down. This was days after 9/11, and the security, because this was a military vessel, and I was down in this dry dock.
Yeah.
Happily, I had a minder with me, taking photographs.
Yeah.
The officers of these ships have to turn the vessel over to the dry dock when it's being refitted. And so they had just turned over possession, and suddenly they saw this guy, and this guy really was very upset.
Oh, sure.
What's the guy taking pictures? Why is he down there? So that was kind of added to the thrill of the day. But I just love the sense of scale in this place.
Yes, I do
these kinds
too.
of places.
Yeah.
It's
really
not a
captures
huge
it.
ship, but it just looks pretty huge when you stand beside it like that.
Yeah, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Very
So
good.
So that's kind of how the industry has unfolded, and it's really the thing for which I'm best known in the art world. Basically, no one else was working in this area, and so I kind of owned it. And I still would do some more, and still have some intentions of doing more, but other things have swept me away from it for a while, so I'm doing other things. But that is one body of work on what I think of myself as doing certain kinds of work, and that's one of them.
Right.
Another thing that I've been doing is, again, this is kind of by periods, on and off. First I do one, then another. But this is an example of a work I did, which I call travel paintings, or studio paintings from my travels. I don't really have a very clever name for them. But this piece is from the Boundary Waters canoe area, which is a wilderness area in the very north of eastern Minnesota at the Canada border.
Right.
And along with some colleagues from Parkland, we go up there once a year. They've been going for many years. I've been several times with them, and they're serious fishermen. So at the end of their spring term, they go fishing. I don't care much about fishing, but I go with them and I draw and paint while they're fishing. So we visited all kinds of places in the Boundary Waters, and this particular one was a curious, I call this thing River of Grass, because there was a channel probably not a lot wider than the canoe that went on for miles, rocks barely below, and at one point, in fact, in the far distance here, there's a beaver dam. We had to go over that beaver dam to keep going, and I was sure we were going to see a moose.
Sure.
This is where a moose should live, but
right.
we didn't see
like
one. And for all my years there, I've never seen one, so I still have to keep going. So anyway, this is a piece that I would do from photos and memories and paintings that I have made there. All of those elements becoming resources to make a more studied, careful painting here in the studio.
Right.
And on a piece like this, I might use a couple weeks, maybe a little longer.
Okay. You know, one of the things that's always struck me about your work, and the viewers may not be able to see this, is how many small strokes there are in your paintings. I mean, there's just literally hundreds and hundreds. It's amazing just to see that texture and just to when you actually see the paintings up close.
Well, it's interesting because for a very long time, through most of my work in the 70s and 80s, although it had realist subject matter, the painting technique was very big, smooth washes, overlaid washes, much like you might do in a big sky where there really is no texture. And that sort of characterizes an awful lot of watercolor painting. That's kind of what it does that no other medium does very well. But as I began to work on the landscapes, and particularly the Kansas landscapes, which we'll look at later, I was presented with this dense mass of textures. And as I said earlier, watercolor has always been understood I have always understood watercolor to be a drawer's medium. And when you draw, quite often you might use a series of marks to create a shaded area, hatch marks. So that's a natural drawing, muscular thing to do. And so, but as I was presented with this texture, and I began to think of it as describing every blade of grass, so to speak, you know, and thinking of textures. And it's funny how it just became a drawing with the brush is the way I usually describe it.
Yeah, I can see that.
Instead of painting with the big fluid washes.
Yeah.
Now, in truth, both things happen, and other things too in every painting, but the appeal of the texture and those little marks it's absolutely true that's become a sort of a hallmark of my work of the last 10 years or so.
Right.
This is another example of the travel painting, in this case painting of from the rainforest in Costa Rica. I went with a group of Parkland people, some students and faculty, for a week, 10 days or so in Costa Rica. And we spent most of our time in ag settings because these were mostly ag students and horticulture students and some equine students. And so we were hosted by some ag professors at the University of Costa Rica. And the premise of the trip, on which I just tagged along, was to talk to their colleagues and counterparts in Costa Rica about what they're doing. But we visited some absolutely awesome places and new places to me. So an attempt to paint a landscape of a whole different kind.
Right.
This is back in the Boundary Waters. This is a new piece just recently. Most of these travel paintings are rather small. I paint on a kind of a wide format as in the last several years, mostly because when you live in the prairie out here, there is the sense that it goes very wide. And I'd already spent quite a bit of time on a first series of paintings painting the sky, thinking about the landscape in front of me as a prairie dweller or a plains dweller. Your eye is always at the horizon line. And so the horizon when you're standing is down here and the rest of your field of view is up here. So mostly what you see is the sky. And we have some glorious ones in this country. So I'd started out painting a landscape by painting these dramatic skies, storms and sunsets and so on. And partly as an attempt to get back on the ground, I began to rethink that and I began to shrink them down and go wider. The other thing you think about is how the horizon just goes like a string. So I've continued to work in that wide format, various kinds of proportions, which is quite a common thing for landscape painters to do, but that's kind of how I arrived at that place. So this is a bigger one, although most of them are rather smallish. But again, a picture of Boundary Waters where the lake in front of you can go from a mirror smooth like this to 2-foot whitecaps in half an hour. It's an amazing place. Another body of work that I keep going is what I call on location or painting on the spot. In the previous paintings we've been looking at, you saw how they're slow and deliberate and built up slowly with either little marks or mini series of washes. These paintings exercise that other sort of reality of watercolor, the kind of essence for many people, the essence of watercolor is its portability and its spontaneity. When you're sitting in front of the subject matter and you have a limited time to see, to be there, and particularly for the light.
I was just going to say the light's changing. So
absolutely, and so quickly. The sun, we think of the sun as far away, but in 2 minutes it's changed everything.
Sure.
So in 3 hours, I usually think of these sort of, it's an artificial designation, but a morning or an afternoon I think of as that's how long I'm going to spend on this. And so it's high risk, high reward. You blow a lot of them because you just have to work fast and loose. You kind of get one shot, one chance. But when you succeed, it's got the energy of that kind of working too. So I just love to paint on the spot, and it allows me to do things I can't do in the studio. So whenever I'm in a situation where I can paint, and sometimes I go places, like when I went to England, I went to paint. Then I try to make as many of these a day as I can, as I have the energy for. This is a place in Kansas that is my muse there. Some years ago, my wife and I bought some property in Kansas, and we'd always wanted to get some property in this wild place in the Flint Hills of Kansas, and we did. So we spent every vacation, every school break we could going there, which meant I was seeing this in the various seasons of the year, curiously. And so my paintings begin to have the seasonal character, which I always thought was kind of a hokey thing for artists to do. I'll paint the 4 seasons. But nonetheless, it was kind of unfolding, by default in that way. And so I was out there, and this was an early painting from the summer, and hot day on what we call the outer lane, just a little dirt, 2 ruts and grass in the middle, what we call our road into our property. This, in England, this had a little harbor on the Isle of Wight called Yarmouth, a little small harbor town, Yarmouth Harbor. There were all these sailboats. It was a gray and chilly day. And so I began painting, and if you look on one on the horizon, you see this red stuff coming up from the green trees. That's on a wet day when the paper won't dry, you're moving too fast for the paper to dry. A mixed color sometimes comes apart, and these two ingredients go different ways. And so what's happened here is that dark green is made, one of the colors in that dark green is a deep red brick color. And you can see it's just kind of bleeding out of there, which gives it a real dynamic, kind of loose, immediate, almost alive quality. That's what I mean about painting on location, very fast. Things will happen that you didn't plan, but you get those for free. For better or worse. In this day, it turned out to be for better, it seemed to me. And also sort of my fascination with the man-made, I didn't consciously make this decision. It was where we were and what was in front of me, but I found it to be very fascinating. And I've been in a lot of places where there are boats and ships, and I find myself painting them when I might paint something else. That seems to be my choice.
I love how the water looks in this one.
In addition to teaching at Parkland, I teach week-long workshops sometimes. I've been doing that for a long time. And one of the places I teach regularly is at the Arrowmont School of Arts and Crafts in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. It's literally at the entrance gate to the Smoky Mountain National Park. And so my class is teaching on-the-spot painting, and we basically go each day up to the Rocky Mountain streams and array ourselves along there, and everybody gets their own boulders and waterfall. And so this is a demo piece that I painted from the mountain brook up there, and it is an interesting challenge to try to look at moving water and see what you can do with it. It may turn out that painting it in this spontaneous way is the right way to paint that, so the life of the paint can convey a bit of the life of the subject matter. So that's another body of work that goes on. And most of these are very small paintings, partly because that's how much space I can manage in a short time. And also because of the portability factor. I have a couple of different kits that I take out, which have everything you need to make art, and so this fits in such a kit. So most of that work, which has now become a body of work, because there's a lot of them, there's a uniformity to them because they are about that same size.
And fit.
Close to 9 by 12 is the painted image.
Okay. Let's take a break from looking at those, and I wanted to ask you a couple other questions. What other artists do you think have influenced your work?
I continue to be influenced, and maybe am more influenced now in this time in my career than I was as a youngster, by the giants of watercolor painting. As watercolor is kind of a British invention, and although we have examples of watercolor from earlier centuries, it didn't really catch hold till the middle 1700s and 1800s. And there were a variety of reasons for that, but it's from those early practitioners, those masters, that we got our idea of what watercolor ought to be, what sort of subject matters are likely for it, the idea of the landscape, particularly picturesque locations, because portability was a factor. And even the idea of Sunday painter kind of comes from that time, because the British have an idea that for a cultured person, part of your education is to learn to sketch and paint a bit. And so most everyone thought it was a good idea to learn to at least dabble in watercolor. But you look to the masters who sort of invented the form, and among those are Turner, J.M.W. Turner in particular. He's sort of the father of watercolor painting. Constable and John Sell Cotman. So that period of time had for me importance, but it has for me even more importance now. I understand the work now in a whole different way and in a better way. And then the great American masters are Winslow Homer, particularly. For me, John Singer Sargent in his late years made watercolors. A more contemporary person is Charles Birchfield, one of the most expressive and unique and interesting of the watercolor painters, and a man who dedicated his life to watercolor when no one else cared about it. I mentioned Sheeler. And then quite a lot of people no one ever heard of, including me, that I now recognize as somehow as kindred spirits. I see what they're doing. I admire what they're doing. I can unravel their work.
Okay. I know that the current area of focus for your work is the landscaping paintings from Kansas Flint Hills area. Let's take a look at some of those right now.
Okay. This first picture is called Morning Light. One of a series of 4 pieces made same size to go together as a kind of a suite of paintings, all about that place. This was a commissioned work for Parkland. And as I mentioned earlier, this place, having painted the sky as a kind of an anonymous, large, big idea, and having pretty much eliminated, or I limited the ground plane in those paintings to just a silhouette seen against the sky. So they kind of became evening light pictures without much real information about the landscape. When I got to this place, suddenly what was on the ground really started to matter to me, big time.
Right.
And plus, as I began to paint them, you can still see the sky as this big soft thing in this picture. That idea we talked about a while ago about the texture suddenly presenting itself as a big deal. And then another thing I mentioned earlier that you see in these pictures is the quality of light.
Right. Yeah, that really struck me.
In any painting, that's important. In watercolor painting, it's one of the things you can really magnify. And if you look at these paintings, all of them, you'll see another feature, which is the strength of value contrast, extreme of light and dark.
Right.
And in watercolor, you really need to make all you can of that, because that's the primary building block you've got for picture making. So this is one of the things that starts here that you'll see again and again. You may have noticed that there's almost always a path into the picture.
I did notice that.
So that you don't simply go back and forth across the surface. You can walk into the frame of the picture and move back this way into it.
Right.
So a little road, and I sometimes put something in where there is no road and no river. I'll create some other path.
Right.
This is another picture essentially along that same lane. And if you think about the steel mill we saw earlier, you can see that puddle of bright light, that white hot spot. That's kind of a characteristic of my work too. And then this idea of the evening light and the light flowing over. Watercolor is uniquely suited to allow you those veils of subtle color and light. This is yet another one along a fence line. This is it just shows an old wire gate and a cattle guard in the back, looking to the west between a munched down pasture on the left and an ungrazed pasture on the right. This picture shows another of the things I'm interested in my work, which is the sets of color. The idea of orange, green, and purple is a set of colors that are the secondaries, at least as powerful as red, yellow, blue, but not so familiar. And I try to use those as a kind of another hurdle to make my paintings interesting to me and present the world in a different way. This is yet another view of a standard pasture gate that I happen to particularly like because of that tree in the back. It looks like an African tree or something to me, and I've been fascinated. There's a certain magnetic character to some places in the world, and that happens to be one for me. So I've painted it in many ways over the years. Along one edge of our property is a river, and with a waterfall of about 3 feet in the back, and so I painted along there, and in this case painting it sort of as a stained glass window portal as you look into that bright light, which could also be a white hot blast furnace. Right. It's the same real idea pictorially. I said I painted the seasons, and among the things I've been painting is the snow. I always thought that would be a saccharine, sweet, greeting card, pretty thing to avoid, but once I started, I've always thought it's pretty, I just didn't think you should paint such a thing. Now I've changed my mind. This is a picture of the bridge that you cross, a low water bridge to get into my property. And again, that bright sunny light, that quality of blue shadows that you see on a snowy picture. So those are the kinds of things I'm doing, and I've never worn out my fascination with that spot of the world.
It's beautiful. Well, thanks. I want to thank you, Don, for being here today, and I want to thank you for watching Art Now. Our guest has been Don Lake, and you can see his art locally on the U of I campus at the College of Engineering and Beckman Center, at the Parkland College Foundation and the Tarbell Arts Center at Eastern Illinois University, at the Cinema Gallery at Urbana, and online at donlakeart.com. We hope that you have enjoyed today's show, and we also hope it will inspire you to explore the local art scene and to make your own art now.